Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour, merci Christine, merci tout le monde. Je suis ici aujourd'hui pour déclencher de notre plateforme politique pour l'économie après la pandémie. Merci, and I'm very pleased to be here to, on behalf of the Green Party of Canada, launch a bold, detailed vision for what the world can look like after the pandemic, what Canada can do to set a global standard. Il est encore, évidemment, il est encore trop tôt pour parler de la COVID-19 au passé. Mais ce n'est pas trop tôt d'imaginer, de réimaginer notre avenir. And that's what this document is called, Reimagining Our Future, Reconnected, Renewed, and Resilient. We break down the kinds of things we want to do as a country in 10 identifiable chunks, building on what we've learned. What have we learned in this pandemic? Well, it's not over, but we've learned some things that we wouldn't have even imagined 6 months ago. En situation d'urgence, les gouvernements peuvent agir rapidement. C'est la fin, pour moi. Je pense que nous sommes arrivés à la fin de l'incrémentalisme. Toujours quand on exigeait que le gouvernement du Canada agisse contre les gaz à effet de serre pour éviter le pire d'urgence climatique, tout le monde pense « Oh non, non, lentement, c'est pas possible pour le gouvernement d'agir rapidement comme ça. » Alors, maintenant, c'est les leçons claires que dans une pandémie, le gouvernement du Canada et les gouvernements provinciaux sont capables. We have the ability to take crises seriously and move mountains when we have to. This is something we've learned. This is something we need to hang on to. We've learned that in an emergency, it's the public sector workers, it's the frontline workers, it's the lowest paid and often most ignored segments of our society that keep us going. We didn't turn to billionaires in the pandemic to figure out how we were going to save ourselves. We turned to our elected leadership, turned to central banks, turned to our government, and turned to frontline workers who still need our help. So in building on what we've learned, we've also seen some things that we might like to hang on to, like cleaner air. We know that air pollution is linked to deaths in the pandemic, and that when we actually had a concerted effort it wasn't an effort directed at reducing air pollution, but that was the effect. Billions of people staying off our roads, less congestion, led to conditions that we actually have enjoyed in terms of cleaner air, restoring nature. But we obviously don't want to shut down our economy to have a healthy environment. We must restart our economy in ways that are safe, that create more jobs, and that work for the future. That's why in reinventing our economy, it's a green energy future that delivers the jobs and delivers economic recovery. We make reference in this plan to a recent study that was co-chaired by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and the former Chancellor of the Exchequer from the UK, Sir Nicholas Stern, who talk about the best ways to get economic recovery after the pandemic, lying in investments in renewable energy, in energy retrofits of our buildings, and in things like tree planting, things that will create massive amounts of employment, starting up quickly, things that our governments can do, and we call on massive infrastructure investment, particularly to have a coast-to-coast-to-coast national energy corridor in our electricity grid so that we can deliver clean, green, renewable energy from one province to the other. You know, it's easy to think that this might be the sort of economic recovery that we looked to after the 2008 financial crisis. And I think it's important to recognize that this is not one of those moments. This is what historians call, I think it is a hinge moment in history. C'est nous sommes à un moment charnière de l'histoire. C'est un événement rare. Lors de ces moments de l'histoire, les moments kairos, tout change. And we hear it from Canadians. A recent poll with ECOS found that 73% of Canadians expected not just small amounts of change. 73% were comfortable describing post-pandemic as a time of transformative change. Many, many groups, organizations, and individuals are realizing we don't want to go back to normal. If that normal means leaving our seniors in inadequate care, if that normal means Canadians one or two paychecks away, even one paycheck away from being able to keep a roof over their head, the inequality that was normal, the treatment of our seniors that was normal, the levels of pollution that were normal, none of this is really acceptable. So it's become common to see people say, we don't want to bounce back. We want to bounce forward. So this plan also takes into account what we want to do for our social safety net, ensuring that long-term senior care falls under the Canada Health Act, that we develop national standards, and that it's properly funded. We also know through pandemic, a lot of people are saying, were these global supply chains, this mania for just-in-time delivery, was this a really good idea? What about personal protective equipment, PPE? Shouldn't we be manufacturing more of that in Canada? So we do have, these are all things that Greens have called for over the years, a more relocalized economy. Shouldn't we be capable of producing more PPE in Canada? Shouldn't we have a focus on greater food security, local food security, more access to the things that are grown in Canada for local healthy consumption? And when we look at the industrial livestock model, does it make sense to have only 3 major slaughterhouses for the whole country that when one shuts down creates such pain and uncertainty for people in that sector? We can rebuild for better. And the inequalities that existed before pandemic that are still there, that have a very high priority, start with the need for reconciliation, truth, and justice for Indigenous peoples, that we take on board and make our laws consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that we pay attention to the need for changing our policing systems to eradicate the deep racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism that is embedded in the way in which we police our communities. We have a lot of progress that can be made in a moment when everything opens up. Joining us for this morning's press conference is the interim leader of the Green Party of Canada, Joanne Roberts. She's in Halifax and she's on the phone line. And before summing up, I want to make sure I turn to Joanne on the telephone for some comments.
Merci, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. I want to stress that this document, which we're very proud of, we did not do this alone. We heard from our members, one example being that 15,000 people wrote to us to ask that the government convert the CERB into a guaranteed livable income. We also consulted other organizations that are asking that we build back better. Lead Now, Greenpeace, Native Women's Association of Canada, FCM, our Canadian Worker Co-op Federation, the UK Greens and the German Greens. I think that's been an important lesson for all of us, and one that Canadians are demanding of political parties in particular. We are all in this together. Nous sommes tous dans le même bateau. And therefore, we must work to find a way to get beyond just individual political interests and work in the interests of all Canadians. I think you are right, Elizabeth. We've learned a lot of lessons from COVID-19. We continue to mourn the lives lost. We struggle with those who are pushed to the edge of the stress of this pandemic. We remain grateful for all our frontline workers. But I think if we do not learn those lessons now, we do not want their sacrifices to be in vain. So c'est pourquoi nous lançons aujourd'hui réimaginer notre avenir, notre plan pour un Canada reconnecté, renouvelé et résilient après le COVID-19. Merci beaucoup.
And just in conclusion, I say a lot of Canadians are looking for how we're going to pay for all this. It's very important.
Right.
it's very important that as we emerge and as the economy reopens, it's very important. I'm certainly hoping that Finance Minister Bill Morneau and the Prime Minister and the whole Cabinet understand how critical it is that we not be seized with any false, premature notions of austerity that could plunge us into a deep depression. We think it's time to re-examine monetary policy and to do it globally. So we're also calling for the Government of Canada to potentially take a lead in an international conversation similar to the one at the end of the Second World War among the Bretton Woods institutions. C'est nécessaire d'avoir une politique pour un monde plus juste et plus sain. Et pour ça, c'est important d'atteindre les objectifs de développement durable des Nations Unies. Comme mon petit, c'est les 17 buts de Nations Unies dans les objectifs de développement durable. It has to be a fairer world for all and leaving no one behind. Thank you, and we're open for questions.
We'll now take questions, starting with the questions on the phone. Quick reminder, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions, commençant au téléphone. Une question suivie par journaliste, opératrice. Avons-nous notre première question?
Merci. Thank you. The first question is from Elie Bertium from the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. Your line is now open. What's running it with?
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering about the timing of this announcement and this policy. Does this have anything to do with, why are you releasing now? And does it have anything to do with the talk that we are kind of seeing a little bit about a possible fall election?
Oh, I think the time is right. The timing, to be quite honest, is not related to a fall election at all. I don't think there could be a fall election. I think it would be unwise. I think we're still in a pandemic situation. And of course, it is a minority parliament. Anything could happen. But personally, I'm not thinking of a fall election. The party as a whole, and as Joanne Roberts just mentioned, consulting with many Canadians, people want to know what's next. We need to know that there's a plan and a vision, and getting those ideas on the table. It's not too early to do that. The public health advice still has to be paramount. I mean, I wear my mask. I'm very careful. I stay 6 foot distance. I think I'm still very concerned that our success rate on COVID-19 is not as good as other countries. And I think we have to pay attention to making sure we're through this pandemic before we start becoming too partisan. I'm very, very unhappy with what happened yesterday in this House. I'm very unhappy that partisanship is raising its ugly head again when we really should be setting it aside to do the work Canadians want us to do. So to timing, we wanted to have something out in the month of June when Parliament is still sitting, when the COVID-19 committee is still sitting, when there's an opportunity to share some ideas with other parties, but primarily with Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
And as a follow-up, I haven't seen any numbers associated with this framework. Maybe that's putting the cart before the horse in some ways. But what I'm getting from what you're laying out is quite a transformational approach to the economy, and I'm wondering how you pay for that, especially and if you could expand on your comments earlier about the government warning, I guess, about the government not starting down a path of austerity.
Yes, well, the economic, the advice that one sees that's coming out around the world is that there's a very significant risk of a deep global depression, and it would be triggered by such things as taking Stephen Harper's advice from his recent column in the Wall Street Journal. It would be absolutely, at this point, madness for governments around the world to stop spending money to take care of their people, because that's essentially what we've got to keep going. And we had a transformative plan in the last election as Greens. The Parliamentary Budget Office reviewed our plans and said that would all work if you could get, because we focused on a wealth tax, we focused on closing tax loopholes. The concern PBO had wasn't that our numbers were wrong, but that rich people are very capable of figuring out how to take the steps to avoid the tax they're now being asked to pay. So that question remains. But the bigger question, which is central banks all around the world are following the same steps right now. Canada is not alone in an economic crisis. We're not alone in pandemic. And the things that the governor of the Bank of Canada has done and the things our government is doing are roughly along the same lines as most other countries. So the Bank of Canada slashing interest rates, providing sort of not quite quantitative easing, but making sure there's liquidity, there's money entering the market through buying of bonds and so on. But when we were at the Finance Committee talking to Stephen Paulos, and one of the members asked if this wasn't policy that could be inflationary post-pandemic, and he immediately said, "No, that's a problem I'd love to have." I think were his exact words. We're much more worried about deflation. So the traditional arguments against the modern monetary theory that as long as what you're borrowing and exchanging between the Bank of Canada and the economy of Canada is staying within your own national boundaries, you're really not risking anything to be able to finance your recovery from monetary policy, from looking at the Bank of Canada as a lender where we're not becoming indebted to foreign lenders and high interest rates. So I think we do need to examine that question. How do we fund this? How do we finance this? And can we be more creative? Modern monetary theory is at this point really getting wind in its sails, because our traditional approach for the last number of decades has been to be very, very worried about inflation. I don't think that's going to be our problem right now, and I think it's time to actually convene a global conversation among central banks, the G20, a larger conversation about what structures do we need multilaterally. And we think multilateralism is critical, very concerned about, of course, Donald Trump, as ever, calls for an approach that is extremely dangerous at a time when we have to pull together even more. We need our multilateral institutions. We need to strengthen multilateralism. And that includes, in our economic plans, we need to talk about what else could work. For instance, re-examining the way the trade relationship between trade and the environment. And we have to look at what's going to happen to developing countries. In this document, we say it's time to look at developing country debt and see if this isn't the time for what we used to call a Jubilee year to eliminate third world debt so that they have a capacity. I mean, think of our capacity to recover after the pandemic. We're a wealthy, industrialized country that went into this crisis with the best debt to GDP ratio in the world. What are we going to do for developing countries that are at this point at the beginning of their experience of pandemic and already are plagued by numerous threats, including impacts of climate emergency events that knock back their development by decades? There's a rather horrific perfect storm heading towards developing countries that includes lack of food security and famine. And Canada, as wealthy and as secure as we are not a gated community on the planet. We have to be there for the weakest members of the human family to make sure that we rally round among those other countries within the G7 that have the wealth, have the capacity, and can think globally in this time of post-pandemic. Reimagining a better world is global in its reach.
Opératrice, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from Yasmine Mehdi from Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Bonjour, Madame May. Vous parlez d'un moment charnière pour repenser les modèles économiques, mais est-ce que vous pensez que le gouvernement va être sensible à ce que vous proposez ou qu'au contraire, on va choisir de se tourner vers des façons plus traditionnelles de relancer l'économie, comme on a vu après 2008, parce que je comprends que vous vous inquiétez d'une possible période d'austérité?
Oui, merci pour la question. C'est la question clé. C'est possible d'imaginer. Pour nous, c'est clair que la volonté publique est tout à fait d'accord avec l'idée d'un changement transformateur. Maintenant, c'est le moment. C'est temps. Mais je pense qu'il y a une question pour le gouvernement, pour le Parlement. On doit penser qu'est-ce que c'est possible maintenant? Qu'est-ce que c'est les décisions avec l'impact plus positif vers notre société pour une société plus juste, avec un accord de justice sociale plus inclusive, par exemple avec revenu garanti durable pour tout le monde. C'est une politique de Parti vert il y a quelques décennies, mais maintenant, tout le monde parle d'idée d'avoir un système de revenus garantis abordable à niveau durable. Et c'est le moment pour les aider plus grands, énormes, transformateurs, pas comme après la crise économique de 2008. À l'époque, nous avons pensé que nous sommes dans une grande crise, mais au contraire, maintenant, la pandémie de COVID-19 était clairement plus grand, mais aussi il offre un moment comme j'ai dit et comme vous avez dit, un moment de charnier de l'histoire. C'est rare, mais maintenant, c'est un moment comme ça.
Et je me permets de vous relancer sur la question de est-ce que c'est possible? Parce qu'aujourd'hui, bon, il y a des organismes comme Équiterre qui ont fait une sortie pour demander au gouvernement un projet de loi avec des mesures contraignantes. On parle d'un budget carbone. Est-ce que vous pensez que de tels changements vont être possibles concrètement, surtout dans notre contexte de fédération, en tenant compte des dissidences qu'il pourrait y avoir de certaines provinces?
C'est clair, oui. C'est clair qu'il était absolument obligatoire d'avoir un plan économique qui rende les changements positifs vers toutes les régions, toutes les provinces. Mais c'est aussi très clair que nous restons dans une crise d'urgence climatique. Il est pire maintenant que l'année passée. Nous sommes actuellement à un niveau de concentration de gaz à effet de serre atmosphérique plus haut que dans les dernières 23 millions d'années. C'est un moment de crise. Nous n'avons pas le temps de ralentir les efforts climatiques. Au contraire, on doit redoubler les efforts. Et 2020, c'est l'année dans l'accord Paris où le Canada est obligé de changer nos cibles vers un objectif plus agressif avec le but de évertir un niveau de réchauffement de la Terre plus que 1,5 degré Celsius. Alors, ce n'est pas possible d'arrêter les efforts pour notre climat. J'ai entendu que le Premier ministre a dit ça, le ministre de l'Environnement a dit ça, mais nous n'avons pas vu leur plan, le nouveau objectif. Et dans la plateforme des libéraux, dans les dernières élections, ils ont fait une promesse d'avoir un but de zéro carbone ou carbone neutralité par 2050. On doit avoir un plan. Parce que maintenant, le cible du Canada reste le même que le cible de M. Harper. Ce n'est pas acceptable. C'est faible. Ce n'est pas... c'est en ligne d'avoir un niveau de réchauffement de la Terre de 3 ou 4 degrés. C'est dangereux. On doit le changer.
Prochaine question.
Merci. Thank you. The next question is from Campbell Clark from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead. Your line is now open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Hello. Thank you for taking our questions, Ms. May. You referred to modern monetary theory and you called for Canada to lead a new series of Bretton Woods discussions. I don't understand either. Could you please explain to me?
You don't understand either concept? Well, at the end of the Second World War...
I know what the Bretton Woods were.
Yes.
I don't understand what you mean by modern monetary theory and what you want Canada to lead in terms of new international discussions of international institutions.
Well, it seems to us as Greens that now is a good moment to convene nations as they convened at the end of the Second World War. This isn't a moment as big as coming out of the Second World War. When the Parliamentary Budget Office looked at the levels of debt and deficit that we will have at the end of COVID 19, they didn't look to 2008 for their comparison. They looked at the Second World War. So the kinds of institutions, the International Monetary Fund was established in the Bretton Woods institutions, as of course you know, but it was to set the level of the value of the dollars from one country to the other. It set that policy. Over the years, the IMF has veered off of what it was originally established to do. What is the IMF supposed to do right now? What would we like to think the World Bank does? Is the World Bank in 2020 the institution we need for a post-pandemic recovery? Does it need to be dusted off and reviewed? The GATT that was established at the Bretton Woods institutions, the GATT since then has morphed into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, and through the Uruguay round, we now have the World Trade Organization. Is it properly attuned to the crises of the 21st century? It, I think, is an important moment where I'd like to feel as a Canadian that because we do have the respect of the world in many corners of the world, we could convene with other nations a discussion of, do we need different institutions now? And have our central banks in what I think can be described as almost a mania of avoiding inflation and been hyper vigilant against inflation. Does that policy make sense now? What will happen if artificial intelligence starts delivering goods? What if renewable energy starts delivering energy that's at basically zero marginal cost? Once you've installed your solar and installed your wind, you're not buying fuel anymore. So what happens if our bigger concern becomes deflation and not inflation? Those conversations among brilliant economists are already happening. I think it would be good to have those conversations with government leaders and see whether or not, it's not just, obviously it's not my personal opinion, but as Greens, we think it's time for a global conversation about whether the institutions we created at the end of the Second World War are ideal for our current situation.
So as a follow-up, I understand that you think it's an important moment where the institutions should be reviewed. Are you suggesting that the institutions should be changed in any particular way? Like, do you see an actual specific need there? Or are you just saying it's time to review? And what does that have to do with modern monetary theory? Could you please explain to me what you mean by modern monetary theory?
Modern monetary theory, and there are a number of leading economists, but I know I'm running out of time here, but modern monetary theory basically puts forward the notion that rather than have governments worry about debt, they should look at within the sovereign wealth of a country, we can have exchange. In other words, the Bank of Canada could provide money for our recovery so that we were not in further debt except to ourselves. We'd like to examine that as a possibility.
And we'll now take questions from the room. Nous prenons maintenant les questions dans la salle. Mackenzie?
Hi, Ms. May. Mackenzie Gray with CTV. You focused earlier a little bit on your disapproval of what happened yesterday in the House. I'd just like to go back to that. Some pretty serious bickering between the parties. I haven't seen anything like that. I don't know if you've seen anything like that. I just want to get your reaction to what happened.
Well, what made it so sad was that the last few months have been typified more by cooperation and less partisanship. And that's what allowed us to pass a number of pieces of emergency COVID-19 legislation. I won't take the time to review them, but the CERB and the CEBA and things were passed given a parliament that was prepared to do things by unanimous consent. So the resurfacing of partisanship, not that it was ever completely without partisanship, but the resurfacing of partisanship to the extent that we didn't even pass a disability benefit to people currently collecting the disability tax credit. Now, I did make the point in the House in the questioning period that it still left out far too many people. I'd like to see it extended, but there was nothing wrong with passing at least that. And I thought we had unanimous consent to do that when they split the bill out and said, well, at least today we can get through using the Income Tax Act to look at the information, to find the people currently getting the disability tax credit, and give them a one-time only payment of $600. I don't know what possessed those in the room who denied unanimous consent to that. Right up to that moment, I thought I'll be here for the rest of the afternoon. We'll be debating this portion of the bill. The temptation of partisanship, and it's contaminated the House for some time now, particularly the Conservatives complaining that we need to get back to having Parliament meet on a regular basis. I want to support the call to have Parliament function more pass more bills. And to do that, I believe what we need is being able to vote at a distance. That's the piece that's missing. But on current public health advice, it would be extremely irresponsible to say Parliament can meet the way it normally meets, because you can't have 338 people in that chamber and not be increasing the risk of spreading COVID-19 in the communities we represent when we go home after gathering in Ottawa. So I don't want MPs to be vectors of disease. The partisanship of the Conservatives has been particularly, I have to say, disappointing, because I don't hear them putting forward an alternative. I don't hear Andrew Scheer saying what he proposes instead. When people say you want 338 people in the room, he says, that's ridiculous. We didn't say that. Well, what do you want, Mr. Scheer? You've said that it's wrong that we're not meeting. We are meeting more than many other parliaments, but what we do need is to be able to take on legislation where we don't have unanimous consent. And the way to do that is to be allowing us to vote remotely, electronically. The Speaker of the House has said it's doable. It's very easily doable. So that's the missing piece. Unfortunately, we're back to the catch-22. We can't get voting at a distance without that going through by unanimous consent. So we're rather, at this point, scuppered in the ability that Parliament, and as parliamentarians, I want us to be useful. We're working hard. Goodness knows I've never worked as hard in my life as since we adjourned March 13th. And the Canadians don't always see that. But the reality of it is we need to be able to vote at a distance. And for that, I think people should be more cooperative and a little less partisan. Yesterday was just embarrassing and really a disgrace.
So judging from your remarks there, you would lay the blame at Mr. Scheer's feet for this, seeing as the Liberals split the bill up. Is that a fair assessment?
I think, yes. I find Mr. Scheer's hypocrisy on this subject galling. I remember the supplementary estimates in June 2011. I'd just been elected. And in the time it took me to walk from the Senate after the speech from the throne back to the House, billions of dollars in spending were deemed, studied, and approved under the Conservatives in that period when they had a majority. Nobody saw them even for 4 hours. Now they're complaining. I know 4 hours isn't long enough to study billions of dollars of supplementary spending, but coming from the mouths of the Conservatives who didn't look at it for 10 seconds, it's a bit galling. I know Mr. Scheer complains that Justin Trudeau took a knee and went to a protest against anti-Black racism. Mr. Scheer personally crowded out my space by deciding to bring his whole family on an airplane. I find the hypocrisy hard to take. And in the case of the Liberals, I'm not agreeing with all their decisions. I think the bill that was put forward yesterday and the notion that we were going to crack down on CERB recipients and send people to jail was appalling. But we did have a compromise, and we should have gone for it.
Good morning, Ms. May. Ashley Burke, CBC News. Yesterday, the RCMP's Commissioner Brenda Lucki talked about how there was many different definitions of systemic racism that she's heard recently, and only went as far as saying that there was unconscious bias in the RCMP. What do you think of that? I think the RCMP is a racist institution, and I say this carefully. I love many individual RCMP officers, know many RCMP officers who do a fine job. But when you think of it, it comes from the top down. So contrast the careful, respectful, beautiful way in which the RCMP arrested me in March of 2018 in the Kinder Morgan protests with the organized top-down decisions to militarize the police force at Elsipogtog in New Brunswick, for the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, the arrests there, throwing people to the ground who were in peaceful protest, wrenching their hands. I saw those protests. And when you video those protests, those arrests were decisions within the institution. I think the reason I got arrested nicely is that I'm white. And I look at Chief Alan Adams' face. The killing of Chantal Moore is so heartbreaking. So heartbreaking. So I'm afraid that my experience is that we need to really consider that it's not the random bad apple. This is decision-making within the institution itself that decides that Indigenous protesters can be treated one way and white protesters can be treated another way. What do you think of Greta Thunberg signing a letter to UN ambassadors of small island states saying that Canada and Norway both only give lip service to climate action, and that should affect their chances as they fight for a temporary UN Security Council seat? Do you agree?
Absolutely. And Norway's done much more than Canada. Greta Thunberg is absolutely right. And I think, we still have time to move in this direction. As I said, 2020, under the terms of the Paris Agreement, is the year when Canada must improve our target. We are required to table a new target in this calendar year. And the sooner we double our target to the one that science requires, just give you a quick reference point, the European Union overall, countries like the UK is currently 40% below its 1990 levels of emission. Most of Europe, I won't break it down by country, is in that ballpark, 35 to 40% below 1990 levels. Canada is 17% above our 1990 levels. Of all the countries within the industrialized world, we are one of the worst. So, of course, our record has to count in voting for a Security Council seat. And we can improve that. We can become I still hope for the moment, that Canada is a climate leader, saying, look, we are a country that produces fossil fuels. We're going to continue to produce fossil fuels in the transition to renewable energy. But we're going to double our target so that we can help the world hold to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Thank you, Ashley.
We'll go back on the phone. Do we have another question, operator?
Once again, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad if you have a question. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à faire étoile 1 pour toute question. There are no questions registered at this time. Aucune question pour le moment.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.
Merci tout le monde.